Ukrainian forces are making progress in the south and scoring big victories in the east. Ukrainian soldiers continue their onslaught in the Zaporizhzhia area with limited results. In addition, the Ukrainian armed forces are undertaking operations against the invaders in the Luhansk region. The Ukrainian Defense Forces of Ukraine's Chief of General Staff, Andriy Kovalev, continue to execute offensive operations in the direction of Melitopol, Berdyansk and Mariupol on Ukraine's southern front lines. Zaporizhzhia Oblast is still the scene of mind-boggling and breathtaking offensive operations. President Zelensky acknowledged the launch of the counteroffensive after a week of escalation of Ukrainian military activity. At the moment, the most vital front line is the fighting line between Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. Counterattack actions were carried out by Kiev soldiers in at least 4 frontline regions. Ukrainian forces took control of Starobyshev Blahodey, Niskichny and Makivka, as well as Levardansk and Novogeorgievka. In addition to these settlements, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Malyar, said that his forces had secured 4 vital sites in Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. In other words, the Ukrainians expanded and extended their offensive zones outside the 4 regions. Ukrainian forces also carried out local attacks in the Donetsk-Zaporizhzhia Oblast border area, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Mariupol in southern Ukraine was jolted by another explosion, as it became one of the most heavily shelled cities since the war began. Another massive explosion jolted occupied Mariupol this morning. Locals have been talking about the attack a lot. 4 senior officers of the Russian armed forces were killed in Mariupol as a result of the blasts. Storm Shadow is almost certainly responsible for the attack. Pyotr Andriyashenko, an assistant to Mariupol's mayor, corroborated the information, referring to the partisan movement Mariupol Opposition. He claimed that the Russian army was blown up in a private residence in the city's Primorsky area close to the port after the explosion. Local people said that ambulances and firefighters began circling the city. I'm not sure what happened there, but several ambulances and fire trucks were seen driving to the left along the embankment. The specifics of what occurred remain unknown. According to the film from the site, the house was blown up and the rubble was subsequently burnt down. It was also stated that the invaders were preparing for the Ukrainian armed forces' onslaught in Mariupol. According to a UK Ministry of Defense assessment, Ukraine is making considerable progress in some regions where it has breached Russia's first line of defense. We reported that the most intense strikes in Ukraine occurred in Zaporizhzhia East. How did Russia's offensive operations in Zaporizhzhia Oblast turn out? It should be remembered that the Russian army was largely unsuccessful on the Zaporizhzhia front. The Russians lost 4 generals in a short period of time, perhaps a week. 3 of these casualties occurred in the front lines between Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. According to the most current battle reports, Major General Sergei Goryachev was killed in recent clashes in the Zaporizhzhia region. The Ukrainian Army Storm Shadow missile attack killed Major General Sergei Goryachev, Chief of Staff of the 35th United Arms Army. Russia was unconcerned about Ukraine's employment of Storm Shadow missiles manufactured in the UK, although British-made Stormy Shadows have destroyed important Russian bases in Luhansk, Berdyansk, Melitopol and Mariupol. However, with the assassination of Major General Sergei Goryachev, the Russians glimpsed Storm Shadow strength once more. Goryachev had served in Transnistria and Tajikistan after graduating from the Ryazan Guard's Higher Airborne Command School in 1994. After Russia began a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he was promoted to commander of the 5th Separate Tank Brigade and named Chief of Staff of the 35th Combined Arms Army. 2 more Russian army generals were recently killed on the Eastern Front. Aida soldiers from the 24th Separate Assault Battalion successfully attacked Russian fortifications. Ukrainian commander Anatoly Shtyfin said that the positions of the Russian forces' 2nd Corps and 4th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade had been removed from the map. About 20 invaders were killed as a consequence of the raid, including the Russian brigade commander and chief of staff and one of his assistants. Images of the Aida battalion's combat work were uploaded in the Telegram group. The combat took place between the communities of Ivanovskaya and Kazivka. According to the geography, Kulikivka is 5 kilometers south of Bakhmut. The village protected both the city's entrances and the highway from Kostyantynivka that fed the Ukrainian force. Thus, 7 prominent Russian commanders and generals have been dispatched on their eternal journey with the Ukrainian salute since the Start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The withdrawal of this general from the fight is terrible news for Russian President Putin, who is well aware of the high cost of training generals in the Russian army. Conflicts, on the other hand, continue in the Khrushchevka community, which is located 5 kilometers south of Bakhmut and covers both the accesses to the city, as well as the path from Kostyantynivka, which feeds the Ukrainian garrison. While Russian generals were absent from the front lines in Ukraine, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk, the offensive operations of Kiev's supporter 3 legions on the Russian border lines intensified. There are still sporadic mobilizations and offensive actions on the Ukrainian-Russian border lines, and the Russian army has suffered major casualties in these locations, as well as on the front lines in Zaporizhia and Donetsk. The fights of the 3 Russian Legion group meant that another Russian general was out of the war, especially after the long-running Belgorod resistance campaign. Colonel General Andrei Vasilievich Stoichev was assassinated by anti-Putin and Russian nationalist militants in Belgorod Oblast. The murder was claimed by the 3 Russian Legion, an armed anti-Kremlin group claiming to be fighting alongside Ukraine. The 52-year-old Russian colonel general was said to have been slain in street skirmishes with militia. The fighting in which Stoichev was killed occurred near the Russia-Ukraine border in the settlement of Novaya Tarasenka. Stoichev was previously accused of killing civilians in Chechnya, Yugoslavia, Abkhazia, and Ukraine, and the 3 Russian Legion group even regarded Vasily Yevich Zaitsev's death as divine justice. Furthermore, the Ukrainian attacks knocked out a very significant general and relative of the Russian army's overseer, Kadyrov. You are aware that Vladimir Putin receives military backing from 2 other military sources, particularly in Donbass. In addition to his own force, one is the mercenary group Wagner Group, while the other is Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov army. Following the announcement by Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin that he would withdraw his forces in Bakhmut to the city's central front lines, Chechen fighters began to be considerably more active on the battlefield for Russia. Kadyrov proceeded to send his soldiers to their deaths for Putin one by one. Chechen fighters fighting for the Russian army had caused heavy military convoy traffic on the route from Mariupol to Donetsk once more. There have been reports that the pro-Russian Chechen presence has expanded in recent days, particularly in Donetsk. Kadyrov's brother, Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov, was among those who went to the front lines in Donetsk. We are aware that Kadyrov dispatched relatives to the Ukrainian combat lines, but going to the Donetsk region, one of the most active war lines, was a major risk for Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov because Delimkhanov was known to be a field commander in Mariupol. Mariupol is currently under Russian control, and it is a front line with far fewer conflicts than Donetsk. According to Russian telegram channels, Delimkhanov and his entourage were evaluating the front line for prospective use by Kremlin forces before a dam in this area was hit, and they were anticipating the arrival of a top Russian general. But just then, the sound of a HIMARS missile burst out to Delimkhanov. The Chechens around them, the Russian military, and the investigators. Delimkhanov, a Duma member and longtime Kadyrov's brother-in-law, was killed by a long-range HIMARS artillery while heading a delegation to a prison in a Russian-controlled section of Ukraine's Donbass region. The shocking HIMARS strike succeeded in killing 200 of Delimkhanov's soldiers. But Delimkhanov himself, whom Kadyrov viewed as his brother, survived with injuries. The Opletich Carrier Group, a partisan militia fighting the pro-Putin state currently in charge of Chechnya, also confirmed that the HIMARS attack destroyed a Kadyrov unit of 200 soldiers. Some news outlets reported on the day of the HIMARS missile attack that Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov had died. Ramzan Kadyrov then requested information from Ukrainian intelligence on the precise location and positions of the strike. Kadyrov further stated that anyone who locates his brother-in-law, Delimkhanov, will be rewarded handsomely. When it became clear that Delimkhanov was still alive hours after the incident, Ramzan Kadyrov issued another message, repeating same requests. The Chechen commander continued to seek assistance from Ukrainian intelligence in his search for Delimkhanov. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Kadyrov's calls for help were this audible. Many pro-Russian news outlets chastised Delimkhanov bodyguard and local security officials for shoddy work and underestimating the Ukrainian armed forces' capacity to detect a stationary convoy in the open and then strike it with a long-range attack. because it is alleged that Delimkhanov examined a region in Donetsk for the Russians. Vladimir Putin and the Russian officials responsible for the war could not even ensure the safety of Delimkhanov, one of their ally, Kadyrov's most valuable assets. On the other hand, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has devolved into a clash between the Moscow administration and the Russian armed forces, with President Vladimir Putin dismissing many of the Russian armed forces, top generals and commanders as a result of Russian forces' failures in Ukraine. General Sergei Surovikin, who was in charge of the Ukraine operation, was fired by Putin 3 months after his appointment and replaced by Chief of General Staff Gerasimov and Mikhail Turbinsky. The head of the Russian paratroopers was fired after 6 months of service in Ukraine. Now, another surprising name at the highest level of the Russian armed forces has entered Vladimir Putin's radar. And the Russian leader has made a hasty decision to end the career of another Russian general. Let us investigate the specifics of this startling move in Russia together. General Rustem Muradov was recently removed from his post as commander of the Eastern Military District, and only 7 months after his appointment, he was dismissed from command of the front in Ukraine. This scandal in the Russian armed forces was recorded for the first time in 2023 as Putin's dismissal of a senior Russian officer. The debacle of Russian forces in Vlada is seen as the reason why President Vladimir Putin fired Muradov. If you recall, the Russian army had suffered significant losses in recent months as Muradov's command of the Eastern Group repeatedly failed in ill-planned attacks on the town of Vlada in the Donetsk Oblast. So far, the Wagner Group, Kadyrov's group, and the Russian army have been divided into 3 wings within the Russian army, and they have harshly criticized each other. And Russian army generals and commanders have been fired one by one, with around 20 Russian generals and over 1,000 Russian commanders dismissed in the last 40 months. The Russian army, led by General Rustem Muradov, failed to meet any of its objectives in 2023 and suffered massive losses, according to data from the Netherlands-based research organization Oryx. Russian troops lost 103 military vehicles, including 36 tanks, in the Volodya attack in February, while Ukrainian troops lost only 20 military vehicles. In fact, during the attacks in Volodar, a large number of Russian tanks advancing in single file were simply rendered ineffective by Ukrainian forces due to a lack of mine clearance equipment. The Eastern Russian Command has recently received a lot of attention after losing 33 combat tanks due to incompetence in just 1 day. Furthermore, when a Russian soldier fighting in the region revealed, despite tremendous losses, that 8 persons from a Russian unit of roughly 100 soldiers had survived. Tensions between the Moscow administration and the Russian armed forces reached an all-time high as tensions rose. Pro-war bloggers and soldiers operating under Muravyov's command criticized the Russian commander. In addition, according to the most recent UK Ministry of Defense intelligence briefing, Russian commentators, including Muravyov's own soldiers, have widely criticized these operations in Volodar. According to military researcher Michael Kaufman, who conducted assessments on the matter, Muravyov's troops repeatedly struck on open land and in minefields with tiny motorized battalions and gained nothing in Vlada. Muradov had already acquired control of the EGF following his catastrophic effort to approach Kiev from the west during the first full-scale invasion. In the end, Muradov's dismissal, who was involved in a major failure in Volodar and previously served in Syria and the South Caucasus, is interpreted as one of the most significant signs of repercussions within the Russian army, which has been unable to make any progress in Donbass for months. According to Russian Ministry of Defense sources, Muradov was formally told of his dismissal and that the decision was directly tied to the Volodar incident. Muradov, on the other hand, was one of Putin's top generals in Ukraine when he was appointed head of the Eastern Military District on October 5, 2022. Muradov, who previously served as a military advisor in Syria, was also in charge of Russia's peacekeeping force in Nagorno-Karabakh. According to some sources, the first crisis began after Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu met with Muradov and his soldiers on the front line last month. But there was no such clue or surprising statement during the Russian minister's visit to the front. Indeed, given Russia's war policy, it is not surprising that General Rustem Muradov was dismissed in this manner because the Russian administration tries to conceal the bad impacts of the war and the Russian army's failings. When these hidden facts reach an unacceptable level, the Russian authorities intervene and establish a target, which is usually the top Russian generals in charge of the Ukrainian front lines, as Muradov was. And as we have stated, many other top Russian generals were sacked after dismissing the person responsible for the war's failure. The Russian administration resumed its occupation policies as if nothing had happened. However, aside from Muradov removal, there is another unnoticed aspect to this remarkable circumstance. Yes, General Rustem Muradov was fired for his failures in. But what is the current situation of those Russian troops in Volodar? We have critical data on the latest situation of the Russian military group in Volodar. After the Russian general was dismissed, according to a new report, Russia's elite 155th Marine Corps Brigade has been destroyed and rebuilt 8 times since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022. This startling assertion was made by a Washington, D.C. of Columbia-based think tank in its current update on the Ukraine war. The 155th Marine Corps Brigade, stationed outside the eastern city of Vladivostok as part of Russia's Pacific Fleet, was involved in a failed attempt to conquer Kiev early in the conflict. Furthermore, this Russian military unit was one among numerous Russian units accused by Ukrainian authorities of committing war crimes against civilians in Bucha, Irpin, and Gostomel. All 3 communities were located northwest of Kiev and were taken by Russian troops as part of their failed offensive on the Ukrainian capital. With the 155th Russian Naval Brigade becoming trapped in Volodar, the Russian brigade sought to target Ukrainian communication links before attempting to encircle Volodar, but due to a lack of ammunition in the 155th Marine Brigade and the inability to take several settlements around Volodar, the Russians were unable to achieve their objectives. According to Russian military bloggers, current Russian tactics, which include a frontal attack against the Volodar followed by attacks on the fortified Ukrainian flanks, result in high Russian combat losses with no gains due to difficult terrain, a lack of combat power, and an inability to surprise the Ukrainians. The Russian 155th Marine Infantry Brigade had been destroyed and re-established 8 times in all, owing partly to losses sustained during the protracted assaults against Volodar. It is said that the 155th Marine Unit was re-established following the departure of General Rustem Muradov, although this unit did not function as expected. In short, Russia's worst blunder was to attack Ukrainian territory, despite the fact that the Russian administration was dealing with issues in its own army or with its commanders and generals. The Russians suffered the most damage when the war in Ukraine devolved into a war of attrition. Despite having one of the world's best armies, this strength does not make sense at the moment because they are trapped on Ukrainian soil. Furthermore, when Russia fails to fulfill its aims in the Donbass, it is possible that additional Russian generals such as Rustem Muradov will be erased from history by Moscow authorities as being responsible for this war of attrition. Even Russian generals are doubting Vladimir Putin's authority and contesting his commands. Vladimir Putin is having problems with his chain of command with the Russian generals. Mutiny pressuring Putin to fire the generals of the Russian army who have 40 years of military experience. So why is Putin letting go of his veteran generals? Why are Russian generals refusing to follow Putin's orders? A week after the surprise inspection, Russia's Pacific Fleet commander was fired. The Russian Pacific Navy's admiral refuses to send any further troops to the Ukraine conflict. Following that, it was claimed that Vladimir Putin had fired the experienced admiral. Admiral Sergei Avakins, 66, was the commander of Russia's Pacific Fleet until he was abruptly fired last week in May 2012. Avakins was named commander of Russia's Pacific Fleet on December 13, 2014. He was promoted to the rank of military admiral when Avakins received his marching instructions from the Kremlin. He was taking part in nuclear bomber war simulations, according to a Russian Defense Ministry source. The admiral decided to retire after a long and illustrious service. The source attempted to minimize the importance of the admiral's dismissal. According to Yuri Tretynev, Putin's envoy, Admiral Sergei Avakins, 65, has been appointed head of a group responsible for military sports instruction and patriotic education. In these training facilities are set to open in 11 Russian areas, including Donetsk, which Ukraine has illegally annexed. The centers are set to open in May, with at least 9,000 visitors expected throughout the year. The centers will educate persons aged 14 to 35, including students and school children. Furthermore, the rumors of why the Russian admiral was discharged are fairly diverse, with one of them being tied to the Vallada disaster. In an attempt to capture the Volodar, a troop of Special Marines from the Pacific Fleet nearly died. That is why the admiral was upset by the Kremlin's intervention in Ukraine. Russian casualties were high in the eastern Ukrainian town. In just 3 days, the Russian army lost over 100 pieces of military equipment, including 36 tanks. The Pacific Fleet's 55th Guards, Marine Corps Brigade, and 40th Marine Corps Brigade were particularly hard hit by the fighting, losing nearly all of their personnel. Sergei Avakiants refused to send any more of his well-trained officers into battle. The admiral was fired for defying the Russian leader's commands. Another claim about the admiral's discharge concerns his performance in the exercises. Russia performed exercises as a display of might amid rising tensions with the West over the Ukraine war. The Russian army placed the majority of its forces on the Ukrainian front lines. Regular exercises were still undertaken in the Russian army to train their men and demonstrate their readiness. The Pacific Fleet exercises started just as Chinese Defense Minister General Li Changfu arrived in Russia for a meeting with Putin. The bill for the admiral was cut by the Russian leader, who was dissatisfied with the results of the exercises. While the exercises were still going on, the Russian admiral was fired. Admiral Viktor Lena, the previous commander of Russia's Baltic Fleet, took over for Avakiants. As you can see, the instability in the Russian army never ends, with top commanders being criticized for bad decisions made during the Ukraine war. Commanders are rapidly removed from their positions for reasons such as incompetence or disobedience. Given that the conflict is still ongoing, it is just a matter of time before these events reoccur in the Russian army. General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's commander of joint forces in Europe, said that since the start of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, over 200,000 Russian soldiers and over 1,800 officers have been killed or injured. This war is massive in scope. He claims that the Russian Federation has already lost almost 2,000 tanks in the fight. According to the commander of NATO's joint forces in Europe, NATO must adjust to the new reality after Russia attacked Ukraine. If someone brings a tank, you should have one as well. However, one of the lessons of the Cold War is that weapon precision is crucial. Furthermore, the military industry's production capacity is critical. Whoever can win the combat, the fastest wins. Given all of Russia's general defeats, we have to examine Putin's military strategy. Vladimir Putin's disastrous invasion of Ukraine shows all of his personal flaws as a dictator, as well as the enormous damage it has caused Russia. The Ukrainian incursion exposed rampant corruption and ineptitude in Russia's military and defense sectors. But Putin's old pals and associates remain in their positions, rather, are firing many mediocre Russian generals. Putin prefers to circulate them, as seen by the fact that Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov were not fired despite their clear and costly faults. The limitations of Putin's invasion of Ukraine as a leader pushed Russia towards an historic defeat in the early years of his reign. Putin benefited from the hard work of the reformers of the 1990s before him and enjoyed favorable international conditions. But the Russian leader's current colossal flaws are clearly catching up to him. Russia has suffered a massive loss of troops, estimated at roughly 230,000 in total, with 1,800 Russian officers and senior commanders among those killed. The cumulative number of Russian troop losses exceeds the total number of serving armed personnel in many countries. Only the United States, Turkey, and France have more regular military than this number, while the other 28 NATO countries all have less serving soldiers. Even the 16 lowest-ranking NATO member states do not have more soldiers than Russia's force. The British force ranks fourth with 194,000 regular soldiers, which is much less than Russia's total losses. In short, under Putin's war methods, the Russian army is losing hundreds of generals and commanders while also dissolving the chain of command. And it continues to suffer record losses as the war escalates. The consequence of all of this is not promising for the Kremlin, with several top Russian generals and commanders claiming that Putin has reached the brink of insanity. This accusation was made by retired Colonel Igor Girkin, who spent a lengthy time in the Russian armed forces and was lately the most vocal critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin during the Russia-Ukraine war. Igor Girkin made crucial forecasts about the Ukrainian forces' battle strategy, which most likely came true. Nevertheless, the Russian forces did not pay attention to what Igor Girkin predicted. Western countries, especially NATO members, have recently transferred over modern military weapons, tanks, and artillery to Ukraine in preparation for a spring onslaught against Russia. Girkin, who foresees Ukraine's next moves, believes that the Ukrainian army will launch attacks that would divert Russian forces, and that Russia will retaliate forcefully. Ukrainian forces routinely targeted installations supporting occupation operations on Russian soil, causing significant damage to Russian forces. These strikes were mostly carried out using long-range weapons and drones. According to the former Russian commander, Ukraine could infiltrate Russian territory and use provocative measures. Ukrainian forces used unmanned aerial vehicles and long-range artillery rocket systems to undertake huge attacks on military sites near Belgorod, Russia, weakening the Russian military's influence in the region. According to Igor Girkin, Ukrainian forces would launch a provocative offensive on Russia from the weakened Belgorod direction, gaining territory on the boundary line. This move risks tremendous reprisal by Russian forces, who will become enraged, raid the trenches, and unleash a huge offensive. Ukrainian forces can conduct numerous offensive operations in the Belgorod region, gaining a few kilometers of terrain and even capturing a few settlements. Ukrainian forces capturing land in Belgorod is a big scandal for the Russian army and the Kremlin regime. As a result, Russian forces will be concentrated in the region, and many events that are currently taking place in Bakhmut will be witnessed in Belgorod. When Russian forces turn their full attention to the Belgorod region, Ukrainian forces intend to strike the main blow from another direction, effectively ending Russian military presence in Ukrainian territory. Girkin added that Ukraine would not require any territorial gains in Belgorod, but that the attack would be effective in bringing Putin and his entourage out of a situation on the planet of pink ponies. We can say that the Kremlin government has become overconfident. Recently, Russian forces have been carrying out attacks on orders from the Kremlin, where the probability of success is close to zero. As a result of these attacks, the Russians have lost the majority of their forces, and the Kremlin has officially ordered its soldiers to commit suicide. The main reason for Russian forces being commanded in this manner is because the Kremlin was unable to obtain accurate response from the battlefield due to worries of the Kremlin government and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Commanders on Russia's front lines are unwilling to report true happenings on the ground. As a result, the Kremlin is uninformed about the war and attempts to mislead its military plan in Ukraine. At the same time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner militia, exaggerates even little geographical gains in order to obtain Vladimir Putin's esteem, claiming that his forces have accomplished big things. Prigozhin hopes to gain a seat in the Kremlin by promoting himself to Russian President Vladimir Putin in this manner. The most pressing question is what Prigozhin and Kadyrov will do if Ukrainian forces win the battle according to Russia's plans. The Russian government controls the national media, and the Kremlin administration is attempting to put the Russian people to sleep by disseminating fake information obtained from Russian officers and Wagner financier Prigozhin. Through the media, with Ukrainian forces invading Belgorod and Russian soldiers expelled from Ukraine, the Russian people and Kremlin administration will learn the hard way that they live in a vast fantasy world constructed on lies. Even in this event, the Kremlin government might claim that Belgorod was not occupied and that military operations in Ukraine continue because the demolition of an order based solely on lies would pose a major difficulty for the Kremlin. Belgorod is an important city for Russian forces, following Russian leader Vladimir Putin's mobilization decision. Newly mobilized troops were sent to multiple military training centers in Belgorod. The city, which is close to the Ukrainian border, may be used as a launch pad for Russian forces from the north. However, given the current situation, starting a war on a new front while continuing offensive operations in the direction of Bakhmut with Russian soldiers will be difficult. Russian forces will employ every measures to defend Belgorod, which has been through past wars, and the Russian military presence in the Belgorod region has been substantially diminished. The Russian army will require more than its military elements in Belgorod to secure the region as a result of the massive losses caused by the Russian army during the Battle of Belgorod. Soldiers recruited as part of the Kremlin mobilization felt that Russia would fix its issues. But the refusal of Russian citizens to fight generated turmoil in the Russian army. A new mobilization edict issued by Russia in the future will expand the number of military personnel, but it will be inefficient since the new soldiers in the army will have to deploy to the front lines soon, causing chaos in the Russian army. Newly recruited soldiers who wish to flee the battle will abandon their defensive positions, allowing Ukrainian forces to reach a more rapid conclusion. The residents of Belgorod were formerly abandoned to their fate when a Russian official notified the Kremlin that they should be relocated to the depths of Russia as soon as possible. The Kremlin did not take kindly to the scheme due to its financial dimensions, and Putin has officially abandoned the people of Belgorod to their fate. The Russian economy, which has been struggling with sanctions, is currently only providing a budget for Putin's invasion attempts in Ukraine. As long as the failure in Ukraine continues, money spent in the Russian defense sector will be considered waste, as can be seen. Ukrainian forces are fighting a great battle against Russian oppression while the Kremlin is in a deep depression, while the Kremlin is expected to make a move to end this difficult period. The Russian leader prefers to make moves that will put Russia in even more trouble. Although these actions indicate the end of the existing Kremlin government, Russia must be in a more turbulent situation for the Kremlin seat to be abandoned, and Ukrainian forces believe they can do so quickly. The 28th Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine achieved a major success by rendering the Russian defense unit ineffective. The mechanized battalion used a mine-clearing vehicle to blow up the Russian lines. As a result of the large-scale attack on the defense line, all Russian defense lines on the western bank of the Donetsk River were destroyed. Following this surprise raid, the Ukrainians made progress towards the city of Lysychansk. The mechanized forces managed to surpass all defense lines encountered with determination and resolve. Thanks to this great success, Ukraine gained control of the largest front line as the major offensive began. Gaining control of the city of Lysychansk will be a strategic step for the Ukrainians as it will pave the way for advancing towards Severodonetsk, the largest city in the region. Ukrainian soldiers continue to bring down the enemy's most critical defense lines with determination and courage. They have achieved a great success in intense clashes in the region. The brave and disciplined Ukrainian soldiers have laid down their lives to defend their homeland. These heroic soldiers marching forward with unity and solidarity at every step continue to fight for the freedom of their country. Amidst the dust and smoke on the battlefield, the waving of the Ukrainian flag has become a symbol of hope and the fire of freedom. Ukrainian soldiers, known for their dedication to their people, have advanced resolutely, even in challenging conditions far from their homes. At every step, they have demonstrated their courage and strategic abilities to withstand the enemy. The victory of Ukraine is not only a military success, but also a triumph of the will and solidarity of a nation. The people came together to support their soldiers fighting on the front lines. Those praying at home and providing moral and material support have given strength to the Ukrainian soldiers. Alongside the prayers of the people, the Ukrainian army has achieved a great success on the front line during this major offensive. The current developments on the Eastern Front have become a hopeful turning point for Ukraine's future. This gained front has significantly altered the course of the war. The mine-clearing vehicle known as HOR 77 meteorites successfully struck the Russian defense lines, as can be seen from the video footage. This system is highly powerful. The vehicle, which effectively cleared a large area, was now used to target Russian positions. Local sources also revealed that the Ukrainian army launched a meteor attack on the western bank of the river. Assuming that the Russian army had heavily mined the area, the Ukrainians fired the meteor right into the heart of the Russian positions. Following the attack, Ukrainian armored vehicles advanced towards the Russian positions along the cleared path created by the meteor. As a result of this attack carried out on the immediate western bank of the Donetsk River, Ukrainian forces have now begun to advance towards the city of Lysychansk. As seen on the map, there is not much distance left between Ukrainian soldiers and the city of Lysychansk. Ukrainian troops will initiate a larger operation on the region and start to besiege the city. On the other hand, local news sources revealed that General Surovikin, who had not been seen since the Wagner Group uprising, was aware of Prigozhin's plans. The echoes of the Wagner uprising, which has thrown Russia into chaos, continue. And the exile of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the boss of the mercenaries, to Belarus, did not prevent the emergence of cracks in the Russian army. Vladimir Putin's entire plans have been disrupted. Moscow's dream was to capture the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, in a matter of days and install a puppet regime. However, it quickly became apparent that the Kremlin had made a grave miscalculation and Russian forces had to withdraw from the outskirts of Kiev before the second month of the war had ended. The war, which the Kremlin and Russian media referred to as a special military operation, was not going to have its first defeat in Kiev. Although Russian forces had taken control of a line from the shores of the Sea of Azov to the Crimean Peninsula on the southern front, the balance shifted in the summer of 2022. The Ukrainian army launched a counteroffensive swiftly, clearing the area around Kharkiv in a lightning operation from the east. Then Putin had to make the most shameful decision of the war as it reached its 16th month. An order was given for the retreat of the 30,000 Russian soldiers trapped around Kherson, and the Ukrainians saved the only regional capital that Russia had managed to control without firing a single shot. And the days when Ukraine launched its counteroffensive, Russian leader Vladimir Putin declared a partial mobilization, which had been postponed for months, and called for the deployment of 300,000 reserve troops to the front. It was estimated that the losses of the Russian army had already reached tens of thousands. It was precisely during this period that the Wagner group of mercenaries took the stage and launched an attack on Bakhmut near Donetsk. As the winter approached, the longest and fiercest battle of the war lasted for months, and the city erased from the map could only be taken under control by Wagner in May 2023. It is estimated that Wagner lost over 20,000 members in their attempt to capture Bakhmut, which had no strategic importance and was home to 70,000 people before the war. The number of soldiers the Russian army has lost on the front since the beginning of the war has already exceeded 200,000. In the past year, Russian leader Putin, who has not achieved any significant victories on the front line and faced Ukraine's second counteroffensive in late spring, has changed numerous commanders over the past 16 years. Among the appointments that did not provide a solution to the failures, the most noteworthy was General Sergei Surovikin. Known as General Armageddon, Surovikin briefly commanded the attack forces last year. Born in 1966 and having served in Tajikistan, Chechnya, and Syria, General Surovikin was once an ally of Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin. While the mystery of what General Armageddon did during the uprising remains, one news source wrote that Yevgeny Prigozhin, known as Putin's chef, had knowledge of the uprising plan not only within Western intelligence agencies, but also within the Russian army. According to the newspaper, Surovikin was aware that Prigozhin's mercenaries would withdraw from Ukraine and seize the city of Rostov. Speaking to news sources, Secret Service experts said there were indications that other Russian generals may have supported Prigozhin as well. Furthermore, intelligence agencies are trying to determine if Surovikin assisted in the planning of the uprising. According to the news sources, confirming General Armageddon's involvement in the uprising would be the last straw in the ongoing power struggle within the Russian army. According to the newspaper, Putin himself will have to decide whether Surovikin had a hand in the uprising. Additionally, the sources noted that the military uprising could also indicate a significant rift between Putin and Prigozhin supporters. Quoting news sources, the British media, through headlines such as General Armageddon missing, stating that Surovikin has not been seen since the beginning of the uprising. Furthermore, the British claimed that General Surovikin was being interrogated. Sergei Surovikin was appointed to the head of the Ukraine occupation last October. However, by January, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who was known to be close to Prigozhin, announced that Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov was directly responsible, making Surovikin Gerasimov's deputy. General Surovikin had released a video message in the early hours of the uprising, demanding that Wagner Group leader Prigozhin put an end to their actions. Following the coup attempt in Russia that shook the world, there was another announcement. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko revealed that Evgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Russian mercenary group Wagner, which instigated a short-lived rebellion in Russia, was in Belarus. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko made statements regarding the rebellion of the Russian mercenary group Wagner, which ended in Russia thanks to his mediation. Lukashenko stated that Wagner's leader, Evgeny Prigozhin, arrived in Belarus by plane, saying, "Yes, indeed, he is in Belarus today." Lukashenko mentioned that he had a phone conversation with Putin regarding the escalating crisis in southern Russia last Saturday, stating, "From what I understand, the most dangerous thing is not the current situation, but how it can develop and its consequences. I also noticed that it was a tough decision to end the rebellion. I advise Putin not to rush. Lukashenko mentioned that he suggested contacting Prigozhin, and according to him, Putin later told him that he would not answer Prigozhin's phone calls. Therefore, Lukashenko said he tried to find phone numbers to establish communication with Prigozhin. He stated that he reached Prigozhin 1 hour after the start of the rebellion and described the first 30 minutes of their phone conversation as vulgar, saying, "Of course he apologized in advance and started telling me everything with these obscene words." In a written statement issued by the Russian Federal Security Service, it was emphasized that those who participated in the one-day rebellion abandoned their criminal activities on June 20, 24, taking into account the circumstances and the investigative process. The statement mentioned that the criminal investigation was closed on June 20, 27.